Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us today. I am here with Bruce Pardy. Bruce is a Canadian law professor at Queen's University and the executive director of Rights Probe, known for his classical liberal views emphasizing individual rights, limited government, private property, and the rule of law. He has practiced civil litigation, taught in Canada, the US, and New Zealand, and has served as an adjunctor on Ontario's Environmental Review Tribunal. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bruce.
Thanks for having me, Clay. Great to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I would love to get us started here by just introducing you a little bit to our viewers. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you came into your position as law professor and kind of how you have blended that with your political career, let's say?
Right. Well, I'm getting long in the tooth for a law professor. I've taught at law schools for over 30 years now, so you can call me a maybe not a casualty, but I've been through the battles. Um, and as your introduction suggested, I've done that both in Canada, but also in New Zealand and the U.S., which has been a great education for me as well. But part of the role of a law professor, in my opinion, is to try to get a grasp on how things actually work. I mean, there's a theoretical version, a narrative, and then there's a real version. And sometimes the two things match, and sometimes they don't. And a lot of people, including Canadians, have a certain number of ideas about how the legal system works. And then sometimes their experience doesn't reflect the understanding. And that's because sometimes the understanding isn't the real thing. And so part, I think, of the task is to try to explain why the thing works or in fact does not work the way it's advertised.
Mm, Interesting. So, do you think that a lot of Canadians understand what the rule of law means in practice, or is that a niche knowledge?
Well, it's becoming questionable about whether we actually have a rule of law in Canada. Now, the rule of law is a big term, and it means different things to different people. If you read, various legal philosophers, you'll get different versions of what the rule of law means. But I liked to define the rule of law by contrasting it with its opposite, which is the rule of persons. That is, the rule of law is supposed to insulate us from the arbitrary rule of individuals. And we do that partially by separating powers between branches of the state, the legislature, the executive, and the courts. But if you look at how things actually work in Canada now, we don't really have that separation. And we really maybe don't have a genuine, thorough rule of law either. I like to say that in Canada today, we have something more akin to rule by law as opposed to the rule of law. And by rule by law, I mean we have laws. We have lots and lots of laws. We have too many laws. So it's not like we're lawless. But that's not what the rule of law means. What the rule of law means is that those with power are restrained in what they're able to do. And that restraint, I mean, let's not exaggerate. It's not that there are no restraints, but more and more we are subject to administrative whim and the discretion of policymakers inside governments to do as they think best, rather than a restrained set of principles that the courts will take and apply to cases. So we are, for my money, we are traveling away from the territory of living in a country under the rule of law.
Interesting. And you talk a lot about how Canadians need to be more invested in limiting government, right? Not expanding government influence. So in your opinion, where has Canada crossed the line in terms of government overreach?
Well, you can see this. I mean, you can see this all over the place, but you could see it perhaps most starkly during COVID,
Mm,
right? So
How so?
if you think of what you saw during COVID on the TV, you saw, uh, some man or woman behind a podium and announcing today on a Tuesday what the rule was going to be tomorrow on a Wednesday. Okay, that is not the rule of law. That is ruled by administrative fiat. And the COVID experience, I think, has shown us that the country that a lot of Canadians thought that they lived in does not actually exist. Instead, we have another kind of Canada. And let's put it that way. There are essentially two Canadas. And one is the one in our heads, and the other one is the real one. And it turns out that the real one is not a match for the one that we have in our heads, and that was one of the discoveries that COVID revealed. And of course, it's not just COVID. COVID was a symptom rather than the problem itself. But we have a much different country than we thought, and that country is not governed in the way that we believed.
Did you find it surprising to see a lot of Canadians willingly give up their rights during COVID without much pushback?
That's a very good question. In retrospect, you wonder if you should have been surprised. Let's put it this way: I was I was shocked but not surprised.
Mm.
And that's an interesting combination of things, right? It means that actually this should have been predictable. The things that showed themselves during COVID were available to be seen before that. It's just that that it wasn't obvious to a whole lot of people. Um, so it was shocking, but not surprising. And
Shocking, but
it's
not
a sad
surprising.
reflection, I think, of where we're at as a country. As a country, we've always had an inclination, and this is part of our founding story, if you like, an inclination towards deference to authority. And that really rose to the fore during COVID. No, not much pushback from much of the population. A deferential obedience. It's not a good or beautiful characteristic for a country.
Right. And what would you say to people who believe that in emergencies the government should be able to have more control? Why is that wrong or even dangerous?
Well, it's a widely held belief, and it's the way countries all over the world are put together. I mean, it's not just Canada. Countries in Western governments in Western countries generally have the power to make rules in an emergency. But you can see now how that power can be abused, and it is in the hands of the government as to when an emergency exists. That's the problem. If you have the power both to define when it exists and then, having decided that it does, then to use extraordinary powers, that's a recipe for overreach.
Mm.
And people think, well, yeah, but we have the courts. The courts are supposed to be a check on that power, and often they are. It's one of the ideas of the separation of powers. But again, during COVID, we found out that the courts were mainly on side. And here's the irony, that the courts are there as a check on the power of the state. And yet, the courts themselves are part of the state. So you have a
Mm.
part of the state limiting what the state can do. And that's not a good recipe either.
It does not sound like one. And so now, that we're coming out of COVID, we're seeing, 5 years out from the pandemic. Some things have gotten better, some things have gotten worse. It kind of depends on how you look at it. But if someone were to come to you and say that the charter protects freedoms of the Canadian people, what would your response be to that?
Well, the charter was intended to protect freedoms of the Canadian people, and sometimes it does. Occasionally, it's not like you can find no cases where that's the case. That wouldn't be correct. But there are an awful lot of other situations in which that has not proven to be so. And again, COVID is but one of the examples. Over time, our courts, and especially the Supreme Court of Canada, has taken the charter, which in many of its key sections describe what I would call individual negative rights. That is, individual rights to be left alone by the government. Right? So in Section 2, you have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of religion. Those are negative rights, as in the government must leave you alone. Not to be provided with something, just leave you alone. And over time, the Supreme Court of Canada, I think, in my opinion, has taken some of those rights and twisted them into something which is more akin to progressive, collective, and sometimes positive rights. Not always, but not the meaning that certainly I would have given the words on the page if I had been sitting on the court. I think um, that they have taken it and run with it to give it their own meaning. And again, this is part of the problem with what I might call judicial supremacy. When you have a Charter of Rights, it is the court, and especially the highest court, that has the final word on what the rights mean. And there's nothing anybody can do about that other than change the Constitution, which is a very, very difficult thing to do, right? So what?
Yes.
So essentially, we think we are ruled by the Charter, but actually, we are ruled by the court.
Interesting. And so one of my colleagues at We Unify suggested that I ask you to compare and contrast the Charter versus the American Constitution. And since you've
Right.
taught in the US, I'm curious to hear your take on that. How are they different and how are they similar based on your knowledge of them?
Right. Well, they are similar in several ways. I mean, they both articulate a number of, again, what I would regard as individual negative rights. For example, both of them have freedom of speech. The Charter has a couple of things that the U.S. Bill of Rights does not have, and in particular, we have Section 1, the Reasonable Limits Clause, which basically says, yeah, you have these rights, but the government can impose reasonable limits on those rights, yada, yada, yada. And the courts
Mhm.
have given that Section 1 a meaning, and it means that the courts now have the ability to look at the legislation or the program in question and decide whether or not the court thinks it's a reasonable intrusion or infringement of the charter right that you have. So we all think we have these ironclad guaranteed charter rights. Not true, because the court, whenever it thinks it's appropriate, given the evidence, if they say, well, that's a reasonable limit, therefore not this time, right? So that's one thing that the charter has that the U.S. Bill of Rights does not have. On the other hand, even the rights in the Bill of Rights are not absolute because they can't be absolute. Give you an example. If you take freedom of speech and you think, well, the words in both the Charter and the Bill of Rights say free speech or freedom of expression. You think, oh, well, that means I can say anything I want. Well, of course, we all know that's not true, right? So if I go up to somebody on the sidewalk and I go up real close and I say, look, if you don't give me your wallet, I'm going to run you through. Okay. Well, that's just speech, but it's also an assault, right? It's a criminal offense. And so what we know is that that statement in the Bill of Rights and the Charter is not actually true. You don't have absolute free speech because there are going to be limits. And here's the catch. The limit is defined by the court. It's not in the document. Now, no one would argue that you should be able to assault people on the street. But the point is that none of us know where the line is now. And it's totally up to the court. And so the jurisprudence in the two countries is different because their cultures are different and the courts are different. Their makeup is different politically than they are each other. And so our court has tended to be, and certainly is right now, steadfastly progressive about things. Whereas in the U.S. right now, they have more conservative judges than they have progressive judges. And the jurisprudence reflects that difference. So over time, I think the U.S. Bill of Rights has done better than the Canadian Charter, but that's partly because of the way the court has decided things over a long period of time when you compare the two countries.
Interesting. And so, in an ideal world, what would need to be done by the Canadian people to continue to protect and preserve, let's say, freedom of speech specifically?
Well, that's a very good question. Uh, for my money, you would really need to rethink the constitutional order of things. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do in Canada because there's a very challenging amending formula that applies to many of the sections inside the Constitution, including the Charter. And so it's not just a matter of kicking out some reform proposal and having people vote on it. It's just not likely to happen. And even if it did happen, you'd be liable to go the wrong direction given the prevailing political culture in this country, right? So you're really stuck. And that's one reason why I've become very interested in the possibility of Alberta separation. Because in Alberta, you've got what seems to be the possibility of a critical mass of people who understand that something is really not right in this country. And if they were able to come together and pass a referendum and decide to leave, they could start with a blank slate. And instead of, reforming, amending, repealing the Canadian Constitution, you just say, we're just going to leave. We're going to leave that Constitution. We're going to leave the country and we're going to start again. And we're going to take the things that have worked from other places, probably not the Canadian Constitution, hopefully. Instead, you borrow from the American one. Now, the American one's not perfect either. It's got a lot of problems, but it's more structurally, architecturally sound than the Canadian one. You start with those bones, and then you figure out, how do we make this work better? And there are lots of possibilities, but they need to be thought through carefully so that you do not end up with the kind of situation that exists now, which is that the state is policing itself. That won't do.
Mm, that's so interesting. And what is the energy like in Alberta in terms of this separatist movement has been kind of a hot topic. You're not the first speaker to mention this, and so I'm curious as to not just amongst the activists, but amongst the everyday Albertan people. Does there seem to be a very strong desire for separating from Canada, or is it still about a 50-50 split?
Well, you're asking me now a political question about Alberta. And the thing is, I don't really know. I'm not in a
Yeah.
position to tell you that because I'm in Ontario, and
Hmm.
I've been putting in my 2 cents worth from the sidelines, and I've been to Alberta several times now to talk about these things, and the reception has been fantastic, and the sense I get from people that I've met is that this is a real thing. But what the percentages are, I don't know the I don't have my thumb on Alberta politics well enough to actually make an educated estimate of that. All I know is that it's a thing. It's a real thing. It has a possibility, and it is the best possibility for Canada right now. Is my estimate. I don't know what the chances are, but I know it's not zero. And given that, it is the best chance the country has. Now, one might say, well, yeah, but you're talking about Alberta leaving. How is that a chance for the country? And my answer to that is Alberta leaving is the best chance for the country because what this country needs is political disruption. And nobody, especially the powers that be, are going to be interested in any kind of fundamental reform of the way this country works unless there is some kind of existential crisis that comes along in the political sense. And
Hmm.
Alberta leaving could produce just that because it might create a domino effect, a cascade. People might think, well, maybe this country's not viable after all the way it is. And after all, Alberta um, bankrolls a good portion of the rest of Confederation. And so if you take that away, then in those respects as well, it's like maybe the project of Confederation is now in question. Right? So you need something to make people clue in to the fact that Canada is not on the right path. It's not doing well. It's not put together very well. It needs to be rethought. And perhaps the only way to do that is to take it apart. And then whether it gets put back together again, you know, have to wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. It just that it would be that catalyst, kind of a wake up call, which would be very interesting to watch unfold. And this is kind of a neat segue into talking a little bit about the Reclaiming Conference this year. Obviously, as I'm sure you know, it is taking place in Alberta, which should be exciting to kind of get boots on the ground and feel what the energy is like there. But I'm curious as to how you got involved with We Unify and kind of why you were excited about participating in the Reclaiming Conference this season, 2025.
Right. Well, your leadership reached out to me and asked me if I would like to participate, and it sounded like a neat idea. I'm delighted that it's taking place in Alberta because Alberta seems to be the place where things are happening. And people are willing to have the conversation about whether or not Canada is viable and what the problems are and whether or not Alberta should stick around. Um, I'm going to be engaged in a session at the conference called Reclaiming Sovereignty. Now, that's an interesting word, sovereignty, right? Because it can mean different things to different people. And it's one of the both good things and dangerous things about the word. So let's just, for a moment, consider the different versions of sovereignty. People call Canada a sovereign nation, and it is. It's sovereign because it is independent of other nations, right? The crown is sovereign. Now, what does sovereign mean in that context? It means supreme authority, if you like. But reclaiming sovereignty, what do we mean by that? Well, that's the third meaning of sovereignty, which is sort of an individual independence, an individual sort of self-government. And here's the irony. If the crown is sovereign, that is, if the crown, the state, has supreme authority, then the individuals probably don't have sovereignty. In other words, you can't have both. And we have a state right now, if you include these three branches, the legislature, the executive, and the courts, all together, they have sovereignty. They have the supreme authority, basically, to do anything it wants as long as they have the cooperation of those three branches. Okay? And if you have a state with essentially absolute authority, then you do not have individual sovereignty. Right? So part of the task of getting to individual sovereignty is how to do away with the supreme authority of the state.
Kind of bringing power back to the people a little bit. That's a really
Yeah,
interesting point. Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And
absolutely.
bringing power, so it's a very interesting phrase, bringing
Mhm,
power to the people. And
mhm.
I agree with it, but here's the catch. So sometimes that is taken to mean in the democratic sense, power to the people to choose the government, yada, yada, yada. Well, we sort of have that now, sort of. I mean, maybe. We have a democratic system, sort of. And in that sense, the power lies sort of with the people, but it doesn't lie with the people as individuals, right? Democracy is also a dangerous thing because it subjects you to the judgment of the mob. If the mob wants a certain thing, for example, if the mob wants you to be locked down during COVID, well, then you'll be locked down. And if you have individual sovereignty, that means you can say, no, I don't think so. That's one of the tests.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you were to sit across from someone who's debating whether or not to attend this conference, why would you persuade them that it's important to that we are gathering together and to have these types of conversations in person, to not only hear from people that you might agree with and align with politically, but also people that you may have differing opinions from? Why are those conversations imperative?
Well, I mean, this is a very fundamental idea in a free society. Difference of opinion is is the way the thing works. But let me see if I can compare it to the truckers. Okay, so one thing that happened at the truckers convoy in Ottawa in February 2022 is that a lot of people who came to protest were obviously unhappy with government policy, but in Ottawa they were also elated, joyful. And I think part of that was because they had come together and found a whole lot of other people who thought as they did. I mean, not exactly, but basically thought as they did. Whereas before then, a lot of them thought that they were alone. And so I'm not suggesting at this conference that everybody will think the same thing, but I think there will be, hopefully, a critical mass of people who are sort of on the same page about the fact that this country is not in great shape. And there's a whole list of things that maybe should be done and could be done, and sort of to explore what the possibilities are.
Mm, absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. This is going to be a super exciting conference filled with a lot of great information. If you are interested in hearing more from Bruce and some of our other incredible speakers, I highly encourage you to check out our website, weunify.ca, where you can find all the details as well as purchase tickets. Bruce, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you here in just a couple weeks at the conference.